Chapter 9 is all about cellular respiration. There's really just one chemical formula that you need to know for this class, and that's the reaction that shows that glucose, in the presence of oxygen, reacts to form carbon dioxide and water. And if we literally light sugar on fire, if we do combustion, this is exactly what happens. But in our cells, the same chemical process is slowed down, so the energy that's released, it can be harvested and transferred to the molecule ATP. Now, if we do this same reaction in reverse, where we have to add energy to the system to make it go, and the source of the energy is sunlight, that's photosynthesis. So these two chemical reactions working together provide the energy for all of life on Earth, pretty much. So during photosynthesis, the raw materials of carbon dioxide and water are built into organic molecules using energy from the sun, and then in both plants and animals and other organisms, those organic molecules in the presence of oxygen are broken down. The energy is released in the process of cellular respiration. So the waste products of cellular respiration are the reactants for photosynthesis. The products of photosynthesis are the reactants for cellular respiration. So the chemicals cycle through this system, but the energy flows. The energy that comes in as light that gets built into organic molecules in photosynthesis and then transferred to ATP and used by organisms to do work is not destroyed when it's used up, it's released as heat energy. And once that heat energy is released, it can't be reused or reharvested by organisms. There's a lot of energy available in a glucose molecule. From one glucose molecule, our cells can produce 32 ATPs. And ATPs are the energy exchange molecule of our cells. They're the energy currency. So if you just dump sugar on your cells, they can't use the energy in the sugar directly. They have to transfer that energy from the sugar to ATP before the cells can do any work. And so we're going to talk about how that is accomplished in the process of cellular respiration. So when we think about those vocabulary terms that have to do with energy from the last chapter, okay, cellular respiration is a catabolic process. It takes a large, complex molecule, glucose, and reorganizes it into a low energy molecules of carbon dioxide and water. And the energy is released. Okay, so it's exergonic, it's spontaneous, it has a negative value for delta G. Usually when we're talking about cellular respiration, we're talking about aerobic cellular respiration in the presence of oxygen. However, there are steps of cellular respiration that happen without oxygen. So we'll also talk about fermentation and anaerobic respiration. So there are parts of this overall process of cellular respiration that don't directly need oxygen or do directly need oxygen. But usually when we say cellular respiration, we're talking about aerobic cellular respiration. Just another note, we usually start with this nice, neat, balanced equation with glucose, which has 6 carbons, 6 oxygens as reactants, produce 6 carbon dioxide and 6 water. However, glucose isn't the only food source our cells can use. They can use all kinds of different carbohydrates and different fats and proteins as a fuel source. We just use this because it's a nice, neat, balanced chemical equation. So if we took that sugar and lit it on fire in the presence of oxygen, we would get carbon dioxide and water if we did complete combustion. And the energy that was stored in the glucose molecule would be released as heat and light. However, our cells can't literally burn sugar on fire. Instead, cells have to slow that process down into tiny bite-sized steps where they can harvest that energy. And energy is released when the electrons are transferred from one molecule to another. So this process of taking electrons out of one molecule and passing it to the other makes up a series of oxidation reduction reactions. And it's this transfer of electrons that releases energy. So oxidation is when electrons are removed from one molecule, and reduction is when the electrons are passed to another molecule. The thing that gains electrons becomes reduced. Because electrons are negative, they become reduced in charge. Write this down. During cellular respiration, glucose becomes oxidized and oxygen becomes reduced. I'll say it again. During cellular respiration, glucose becomes oxidized and oxygen becomes reduced. When we look at glucose and oxygen, they still have the right number of electrons when we start at the beginning and the end, but the distribution of electrons changes, and we'll look at that in a minute. But for now, we're going to look at a simpler example of oxidation and reduction. So the simplest example is looking at the formation of a salt. Okay? If we start with sodium and chlorine, sodium has 1 electron in its valence shell, and chlorine has 7. Chlorine is also very electronegative. It loves electrons. It pulls electrons to itself. Sodium has just 1 electron in its valence shell. It wants to get rid of it so that it will have a full outer valence shell. So sodium passes its 1 electron to chlorine in the formation of an ionic bond. The sodium loses an electron. So we say the sodium becomes oxidized. The chlorine gains the electron. It becomes more negative, or it becomes reduced because those electrons have a negative charge. We always have to have 2 words for everything in science for some reason. So we can also describe sodium, the one that gave the electron to chlorine, that caused chlorine to be reduced, as the reducing agent. And we could describe chlorine, the one that pulled the electron from sodium, the one that caused sodium to become oxidized, as the oxidizing agent. However, I think that's just really confusing. I'm only going to use this vocabulary. I'm going to say the sodium that gave away the electron becomes oxidized, and the chlorine that gains the electron becomes reduced. If you look at oxidation and reduction in organic molecules, it's harder to see what becomes oxidized and what becomes reduced because the total number of electrons aren't really changing, but their distribution does. So here's a simple example of combustion of methane gas, CH4. So in methane, the electrons are equally shared in nonpolar covalent bonds between the carbon and the hydrogen. And the oxygen gas also shares the electrons fairly because the oxygens are equally electronegative. When methane and oxygen react, we form carbon dioxide and water, which are the same products of cellular respiration. The oxygens are much more electronegative than the carbon. Likewise, the oxygen in water is more electronegative than the hydrogens. So the oxygens pull the electrons towards themselves and pull them away from the carbon. So even though the number of electrons hasn't changed, carbon's hold on the electrons goes down. So the carbon becomes oxidized and the oxygens become reduced. Okay, so it's the same for cellular respiration. Now we have a more complex molecule, but the same thing's happening. Glucose molecule is a little more complex, but most of the bonds in it are nonpolar covalent bonds. So between the carbons and carbons, or carbons and hydrogens, those are all nonpolar. Although there are some polar bonds between the carbon and the hydroxyl groups that make glucose hydrophilic and mix well with water. But the same thing happens in this reaction when we form carbon dioxide and water. The carbon's share of electrons, they get pulled away from it because the oxygens are much more electronegative. So during cellular respiration, our glucose becomes oxidized and our oxygen becomes reduced. Now that's one more confusing thing. Why is it that oxygen doesn't become oxidized? Oxygen, oxidized, they sound the same. Well, it's because oxygen is the oxidizing agent, meaning oxygen is the thing that causes other things to become oxidized. Oxygen pulls the electrons out of the thing that becomes oxidized. So during cellular respiration, glucose becomes oxidized and oxygen becomes reduced. The same thing happens whether we burn this sugar in a fire or our cells do cellular respiration and break down glucose, stripping the electrons, passing them from glucose to oxygen. But instead of doing it instantly in a big flash of fire and light, it slows that process down. It transfers the electrons in little bite-sized steps. And the molecules that do this transfer of electrons are called electron carriers. So these electron carriers go through a series of oxidation reduction steps, and each time they transfer electrons, a little bit of energy is given up, which can be transferred to ATP. So one example of these electron carriers is NADH, or NAD+. So NAD+ can gain electrons. It can become reduced and form NADH. Well, then NADH can give away its electrons. It can become oxidized, and the process can cycle. And so with each transfer of the electrons, a little bit of energy is given up, and that can be harvested by our cells. It's kind of like a little hydroelectric dam, where the electrons fall from one energy level to the next, and each time they fall, a little bit of energy is released. We're going to see that this happens most dramatically towards the end of cellular respiration in the electron transport chain. But in order for this process to continue, there has to be a place for the electrons to go. And the place the electrons are going is to oxygen. Remember, in cellular respiration, oxygen becomes reduced. Oxygen gains electrons. Write this down. Oxygen is the final electron acceptor during cellular respiration. So oxygen works like gravity in our little hydroelectric system here. Without gravity pulling the water down, without oxygen pulling the electrons down, the water wouldn't flow and the turbine wouldn't turn, and we wouldn't be able to release the energy. So we have to have oxygen present at the end of the chain so that electrons have somewhere to go to. Overall, cellular respiration is a series of chemical reactions that transfer electrons from glucose to oxygen, and with each step give up a little bit of energy that can be harvested by our cells. So your textbook actually illustrates in very fine detail every chemical reaction that happens in this process, but we're going to focus on these four: glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, the citric acid cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation. So go ahead and look at the cellular respiration handout worksheet on Canvas and use that to take notes as we go through the rest of this chapter.